Today we have a very special guest with us joining for our live talk, and that's Patti Davis. She's the daughter of the late Ronald Reagan, former president of the US, and she's the author of the new book, Floating in the Deep End, where she shares her own experience throughout her dad's journey with Alzheimer's, as well as lessons learned from other family members on a similar path who were part of the support group that she established called Beyond Alzheimer's. So Patti, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Patti, I just want to ask, why did you decide to write the book Floating in the Deep End? What was the inspiration behind the book?
Well, I ran my support group. I started my support group in Beyond Alzheimer's in 2011. I ran it twice a week for 6 years. In 2017, I stopped doing that for a combination of reasons, mostly having to do with time. And I wanted to take it to another level. I wanted it to license it to hospitals. And I was disappointed, but not surprised that except for 2 hospitals that did license it, I got a lot of no's because the caregivers are just not given enough care. They're not given enough attention. And so then I thought, that could still change. I still hope that it is licensed. But then I thought, okay, well, then I'm going to write a book where caregivers can, dog ear it and mark it up and refer to it at the various stages. And when things come up, I sort of wanted to take my support group and all of the things that we talked about in there and put it in book form.
Right. So in many ways, the book is like an extension of the support group that you established.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
You're able to weave in insights from your own experience as well as other family members' experience, right? Because I think they're universal, no matter who you are, right? They're universal challenges that everyone faces with Alzheimer's, right?
Right. When I wanted to give some background to how I came to the ideas that I came to, how I came to the insights that I gained, from this experience with my father, from this incident, and so that there was a thread between what I went through in that decade and what I came to. That enabled me to create this support group program.
Right. So Patti, let's go back in time now to speak about your own experience then with your dad. And I wanted to ask you, so when your dad announced his diagnosis in 1994, how did you feel when you first found out that your dad had Alzheimer's?
Well, as I've written in this book, I was in an extremely dark period of my life at that point. Everything seemed to have fallen apart and gone wrong. And I really was so low that I was thinking I didn't want to be here anymore. And then I found out that my father had Alzheimer's. And, that could have been sort of the last straw. That could have been what just sort of pushed me over the edge. But instead, it actually pulled me back from the edge because it was bigger than me. It was bigger than my despair. It was bigger than everything that I was going through. And I wanted to show up for it. I wanted to show up for him. And I'd never told anybody about this before, ever. And when I sat down to write this book, I thought long and hard about whether or not I wanted to put it in the book. And the reason that I did was that I thought, someone might be reading this who is in a really dark time. And I wanted to impart to them the idea that there is something bigger than the pain you're going through, that there is someone out there who needs you. There is a situation out there that needs you, that you can be helpful in. So, it doesn't mean that all your problems and all that pain are going to go away, but it does mean that there's a little bit of a balance there.
Right. So in a way, finding out about his diagnosis gave you the chance to do something right? To do it right.
Yeah. I remember I was living in New York and I fled California and gone across the country. And I remember walking around Manhattan after I found out and thinking, I've gotten so many things wrong in my life. I have to get this right. Mm. And, the thing also that I didn't realize right away when that happened, but looking back on it, I can see that really forged one of the main ideas for Beyond Alzheimer's and for my 10 years of his illness, which is the willingness to see things differently. I could have seen this as, like I said, the last sort of nail in the coffin, right? But instead, I saw it differently. I saw it as my way out of pain. And I think that's a really important grounding principle, well, probably for life, but also particularly dealing with someone with dementia, because if you only look at what is in front of you, the person is losing cognition, they're losing memory, they are becoming less familiar to you. But if you widen your thoughts, if you look at it differently, there's still a human being there. There's still a soul there. There's still someone with needs and desires and emotions. Right.
Right. The person is still there, right? Like
the person is still there. I mean, a number of times in my support group, someone would come in initially and, describe their loved one who the diagnosis and everything. And they'd say something like, they're just not there anymore. They're gone. And I would always stop them. And I would always say, you know what, don't say that. And I really tried very hard to never tell people what they should or shouldn't say, but I made an exception on that one. Excuse me. Because if you say, no one's there, then you've just made a human being disappear. Right?
Yeah. And that reminds me of something that you wrote in your book, right? Is about your faith. You wrote that you anchored yourself in the faith that, his soul, and I'm paraphrasing here, his soul won't be affected by Alzheimer's, right? And yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think there were two things. That one was, how can I see this differently? But also the second was, I didn't believe his soul could have Alzheimer's. And, whenever I say that to people and when I wrote it in this book, I always follow that with, if that doesn't fit with your belief system or lack of beliefs, that's fine. And your beliefs are none of my business. Just consider the possibility. You don't know what's not true, you might as well, because it's going to change how you deal with that person, right? You're going to be more alert to those openings in the disease when you can sort of see through and see the essence of that person. And those moments do come and they're fleeting. And if you don't believe that that person is even there anymore, you're going to miss them.
Right. But it must have been hard. I mean, your dad was living with Alzheimer's for a decade, right? Like, it must have been hard for you to anchor yourself on that faith throughout that 10 years, right? Like,
it was. I mean, none of this is easy, I mean, none of us know how to do this when it enters our lives. So none of it is easy. And there was a period where I almost felt like I was losing my faith. But ultimately that is what grounded me. And when he died and opened his eyes a moment before he died, and he was present. I mean, he showed up before he died. Mm-hmm. I just thought, okay, everything I had believed and thought was validated.
Right. And there was a moment, there was a point in time you mentioned in your book that anchoring yourself on this faith was one of the main challenges. Was that after Ronald Reagan, after he fell at home and he had to get a hip surgery, right? And things seemed to be different after that surgery. And you mentioned that the main challenge for you was to anchor yourself in the faith that his soul wasn't affected by Alzheimer's. Can you tell us a little bit more about that time period and how you were able to ground yourself back to that faith that's been so important to you.
Well, first of all, I want to mention that when people, well, first of all, when they fall, but also if they have to go under, somebody with dementia has to go under anesthesia, they typically do not come out at the same level of dementia that they had when they went under anesthesia. They get worse. And it's not usually explained to people. Maybe it is more now. It certainly wasn't then. So there was a big drop in the awareness, the cognition that he still had after that, and none of us knew why. So there was that, and I think, yeah, that was the time that I sort of lost grip a little bit on my faith. Maybe I'm wrong, and it was 7 years into his Alzheimer's, so we've all been dealing with it for a long time. And I think my faith was restored just in moments, just sitting with him. I really believed that there was a communication that went on, sometimes in total silence. And I returned to the man who taught me as a child to talk to God. And I tell the story in the book about being a little girl and going up to our kite flying hill behind our house and asking my father how high do I have, if I stand on my tiptoes and reach my arm up really high, how high up do I have to reach to touch God? And he got down on my level, like on a knee, and said, you don't have to reach up. God is everywhere and he's inside of you. And you just talk to him, you just have a conversation with God. We talked about that a lot when I was a little girl. So that really was my foundation. And, in that time when I felt like I was sort of losing my grip, that was the foundation that restored my faith.
Right. Is reminding yourself of, the sweet memories that you share with your dad in your childhood and other periods of your life, right? That helped you keep grounded. And one of the things you mentioned, one of the topics that you were always able to engage with your dad was water. Can you tell us about Ronald Reagan's love for water and how you were able to use that topic to engage him even late into his Alzheimer's,
Well, he was a lifeguard when he was younger and boasted about saving 76 lives or 77. I always get that one wrong. One of the two.
More than
we'll go with 77. And he taught us to swim probably practically before we could walk. So water was a big element of our lives. And then when I was older and we would go to the beach, he taught me how to body surf. I would follow him out into, surf that scared me, but I wanted to be with him and I wanted to impress him and do what he did. And, a lot of the life lessons that he taught were in the ocean and were about the ocean. That if a wave is coming at you and it hasn't quite crested yet, you can go up through the top of it and come down on the other side. But if it's already starting to crest, if you dive down deep to where the waters are still, it will go over you and you'll be okay. And then you can come up on the other side. I mean, metaphorically, those are really sort of poignant lessons about life,
Is that what inspired the title of the book, Floating in the Deep End, then?
Probably. My initial title was Seeing Beyond Alzheimer's, and my editor said, you need a more lyrical title. And I don't know, it came to me pretty quickly because I thought this is how it feels. I mean, certainly water is like, a big image for me, but that's just how it feels. You do feel like you've been carried out to deep water and you have to float there. Someone said to me, well, that title could apply to the person with Alzheimer's also. And I said, yeah, it probably could, because they're drifting out to sea also, but it sometimes feels like you're in two different oceans,
Right. As if they're drifting into their own like fog of Alzheimer's, right? As people
Mhm.
say. And
Mhm.
yeah, there's on the topic of Ronald Reagan's love for water, right? One of the stories that stuck to mind for me is you mentioned that your dad would do his walks in the boardwalk at the beach, and people would still say hi to him and say like President Reagan or hi Mr. President, right? And
Mhm.
one day when you were walking with him, he asked like, why are all these people saying hi to me, right? And you told him that because you're famous. You used to be the president of the U.S., right?
Mhm.
And he seemed confused at the time, and so you returned to the topic to water, right? To speak about water.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
brought him back.
I didn't want him to struggle to remember something, and I think that's a really good lesson for anybody dealing with the situation. Um, if the memory's gone, it's gone. Change the subject, bring it to something else, change the surroundings. Don't let them struggle to remember things that they can't. And a lot of times, and I've heard this often, people think, well, but it'll be good for them to try to remember. Like it'll be good for them to try to remember how to get dressed. And I think it's really important for caregivers to recognize that that sentiment isn't really even about the person who is ill. It's about you and your reluctance to recognize that the disease is progressing and it's getting worse. And it doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're human. But it's a really important thing to recognize. You're the one who's trying to hold on to, well, if they just will dress themselves, then it's not so bad yet, right? So it'll be good for them if they remember how to get dressed. No, they have a disease where they can't remember. So what would be good for them is if you own that and help them get dressed or have someone help them, right?
Embrace the reality, and then
Yeah.
best support them, in whatever ways best for
Right.
them, right? And yeah, I was just doing an interview last week with a retired physician who is living with Alzheimer's now more than a decade now, and she says it's so important to step into the reality of someone living with Alzheimer's, right? And I think the story that we talked about you talking to your dad about water, right? That's your way of stepping into his reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And
Yeah. Also, I mean, I have a whole section in this book about lying. I called it creative lying. And I think that is a tool that people really need to master, because lying in the world of Alzheimer's, lying is your friend, right? If they think that there are people up on the roof, don't tell them there aren't. Yes, I saw them too, and I got rid of them, and I don't think they'll be back. Or if they think that they've just had a conversation with relatives who have been dead for 10 years. Oh, what did they say? How are they?
Mhm.
Right?
And Patti, one of the topics I wanted to talk to you about is about embracing grief,
Yeah.
because I know that's one of the central messages that you want to get across with the book.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you about your personal experience in terms of embracing grief, right? Because on one hand, you're holding on to the faith that
Mhm.
that his soul will not be taken by Alzheimer's. But on the other
Right.
hand, you say it's so important for people to start the process of grieving early.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about, were you able to start the grieving process early? And if so, like, how did you do that? And what did that look like?
I did it because I chose to do it. I mean, the two things are not mutually exclusive. To say someone's soul doesn't have Alzheimer's doesn't mean that everything else about them isn't falling apart. It is. And I had in my mind a story that a woman had told me long before my father got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and actually her experience wasn't even with Alzheimer's. Her husband had cancer and died, and she had been the main caregiver, even though she could well afford to have help in the house. She didn't really have help in the house, so she took on pretty much the entire task herself. After her husband died, she got agoraphobia. She couldn't leave the house. And she was wise enough to know what it was. And she said, I hadn't allowed myself to grieve. So I was restricted to my home. I couldn't walk out the front door without a panic attack. I had to stay there and deal with the grief that I had been shoving away. And it was such a poignant story for me. And I thought about it early on when my father was diagnosed. And I thought, okay, that's not going to be me. I'm going to deal with this grief as it unfolds, and as it, I'm going to go on this willingly on this journey.
Right. And how do you think your mom dealt with the grief part of it? Because your mom was, how do you think she handled that then? Did she grieve throughout the process? Or
I'm sure she did. My mother did not share a lot. The one moment that I write about in the book was not too long before my father died, and I was leaving the house late in the afternoon, and she fell against me and cried on my shoulder and said, nothing is ever going to be the same without him. So that was the most sort of overt and real expression of grief that I had ever seen from her. I'm sure she wept when she was by herself, and but we didn't have that close, cohesive family where people could grieve together. It just wasn't a reality.
Right. And yeah, that's a topic that I wanted to touch upon with you. I was wondering, what's your observation from, working with folks in your support group beyond Alzheimer's in terms of how diagnosis of dementia, whether it's Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, how big of a toll does it take on family relationships?
Well, I think it does take a toll, but I think again, if you sort of step back and you look at your family through clear eyes, really not a lot changes. If you've been a close, cohesive family, you're going to continue to be that, probably more so. If you're a fractured family, you're going to be that, and probably even more so. When difficult things happen, people cling to what's familiar. So the idea that this really challenging, difficult thing happened and the family banded together as they never had before, that's great for Lifetime movies, but in real life, I'm not saying it could never happen. Maybe it has, but for the most part, it doesn't happen. Your family's going to be what it's always been.
Do you think that was the case for your family?
Yeah. I mean, there was no foundation of closeness there. I mean, we had always been this fractured family, everyone sort of on their own path, and some of it we tried. I mean, Maureen and I tried to sort of learn how to be sisters, but it was kind of like building a house on sand. I mean, there was no foundation there. And it was very sad, because my mother really was kind of the architect of that split family. And now she was losing the love of her life, and she didn't have that fold of a family around her to comfort her. And not that we didn't want to, not that we didn't try. But like I said, there was no foundation there. Nobody knew how to do it.
So was it very hard to help your mom in terms of the day-to-day and or support her emotionally? Was that very difficult for you?
I mean, look, it was, yeah, if anything was complicated in this, it was probably my relationship with my mother, because it was just a complicated relationship, So I would try to gauge where she was at. I would suggest things sometimes, and sometimes I'd just keep my mouth shut. right? Because she was the primary caregiver and she made the decisions. And sometimes she listened to me and sometimes she didn't.
Right. And when President Reagan first announced that he has Alzheimer's, you were still living in New York at the time, right? And then
Yeah.
afterwards, you moved to LA to be closer to your dad and
Yes.
to be able to spend more time with him, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that you mentioned in the book is that the long goodbye of Alzheimer's that people often say can actually be looked as a gift compared to other tragedies in life.
Yeah. So
What do you mean by that? And how,
well, that came to me after the Pulse nightclub, the Orlando nightclub shooting. And the next support group that I had right after that had happened, I said to the group, I've been thinking that we gather in this room to talk about and deal with this long goodbye of dementia. And we talk about the sorrow of it and the sadness of it and the difficulty of it. But you look at something like this mass shooting, and I bet every one of those people would have loved to have a long goodbye. They didn't even get to say goodbye at all, right? Their lives were gone like that in an instant. And their lives ended really looking into the heart of darkness, really looking into evil. And so I think it's important, even though you recognize the sorrow of this long drawn out illness and the difficulty of it, to also say, you know what, it's also a gift. We get to have time with them. We get to have this unfolding of different experiences. And someone with dementia, pretty much dies between clean sheets. And if they're lucky with loved ones around, not so with the people in that nightclub or any of the other mass shootings.
Right. And then at the very end, as you mentioned at the start of our interview, right? Like you saw the sparkle in your dad's eyes when he passed away, right? Like, and that just affirmed everything to you, right? That the core of the person is still there, and
Yeah.
and to be
Yeah,
great.
it was quite remarkable.
Yeah.
His eyes had been closed for the better part of a week. His eyes really hadn't been blue for like a year. They'd kind of faded to this grayish blue color. And the moment before he died, he opened his eyes. They were blue. They were twinkly. He was there. And he looked at my mother, and then he was gone.
Right. And Patti, just the closing it's off here. There's a section in your book. It's in the introduction chapter that I thought was especially touching, and I really wanted to read this to our audience, just to share it to everyone.
Okay.
You wrote that Alzheimer's, like any version of dementia, will undoubtedly bring chaos into your life, but in the midst of chaos, there are quiet spaces, moments of stillness that wait for you to find them. Those places are where you're able to see beyond the wreckage of the disease, beyond all that you've lost, all that you miss, to an unfolding new parts of yourself that were waiting for you to unearth them. And yeah, my question is, have there been new parts of yourself that you found throughout this journey, parts that were waiting for you to unearth? So like how do you think you've changed as a person because of your death?
Well, I grew up. The adult was waiting for me to get there, right? Because the younger girl wanted more from her father and was always like, trying to get more from him and acting out sometimes to get his attention. And when Alzheimer's entered the picture, I thought, okay, you know what? It's time to grow up, because that young girl, like reaching for things that you're never going to get from him, is not going to do very well in this situation. So it's time to go, okay, what can I learn here? How can I grow in this? And how can I show up and be, the strongest, the best I can be in this situation?
Mm-hmm. it's led you to be a companion to your dad, to be someone,
Yeah.
to be part of his journey, to support him, right?
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Patti. Is there
Well,
any final thoughts that you'd like to add, or any words of advice for family members who are going through the same, a similar situation?
well, I think I know I wrote this in the book, that you're never going to be the same person at the end of this journey as you were at the beginning. But how you are different is a matter of choice. You're either going to be harder or you're going to be softer. You're going to be more brittle, more closed off, or more open, more compassionate. And it's that gets down to the choices that you make consistently, through the whole duration of the illness.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Patti, for sharing your stories and your insights. We
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
All right,
Thanks.
bye.
Bye.